here with episode 3 of Rhea and June. Today we're going to be delving into knitting methods, specifically right-hand knitting methods. I'm actually coming to you from Iceland, where I'm traveling and gathering inspiration and having all kinds of woolly fun. I have a special guest that will join us later in the video, just his hands and torso, but his accessories are very recognizable. So he's going to help us demonstrate some methods, not in great detail. Again, these videos are not meant to be tutorials on how to do everything that June describes in her book. Rather, they're my impressions and reviews of sort of what the book has to say about knitting. So June starts with right hand method, which is what a lot of people learn in the beginning. And just to kind of back up a little, you might be asking yourself, why even learn a new method? And June says that it's great to learn a new method even if you already know how to knit, because you can reduce injury or the risk of injury. You can also use it for techniques like two-handed color work. Stranded color work is a lot easier if you can hold the yarn in both hands, which requires different methods. So that all the methods that we're going to discuss in the next few videos have to do, the difference is in how you hold the yarn, how the yarn is wrapped around the needle, and how the stitch is actually formed. But the stitch that is formed and the fabric that's made is exactly the same in all cases, with the exception of some combination methods where you're creating twisted stitches and then untwisting them. You're still going to end up with the same result, but it might look different for a moment. June points out that these methods all have roots in certain geographic locations, but that these are kind of outdated and possibly inaccurate in some cases. So for instance, let's see. Right hand is sometimes called English method, but it also appears in paintings from Germany and Italy. Left hand or continental is also called German, or it was originally called German and then it switched to continental, but it also has existed in Central Europe and Russia. And these Eurocentric names actually belie the fact that knitting originated in the Middle East. And there's evidence from there in Mediterranean countries that methods existed there that mirror the picking and the throwing, or that's what I've always referred to them as. I call English throwing because that's what you're doing, and I call continental or left-hand knitting picking because you're picking the yarn. June gets even more specific and kind of more exact with, I'm using colloquial terms that have been tossed around. Even more interesting is in places like Portugal or in Peru, the yarn and the knitting are held even more differently, and you can see in some paintings that the yarn is held around the neck. It's tensioned around the neck, I should say, and sometimes even pinned to the clothing to help it feed neatly. So if you already know how to knit, or if you've taught someone to knit recently, you'll know that to learn knitting is easy. To master it is, I wouldn't say impossible, but it does take a lifetime, or it can take a lifetime. And that's kind of amazing. That's one of my favorite things about the hobby. But yeah, learning a new method, it feels very clumsy, especially if you're used to being good and adept with your usual methods. So June reminds us that learning is a process, and that it's going to take a lot of time to develop the muscle memory that you need to feel as comfortable doing whatever it is you're doing. Just try to remember how you felt when you first learned just the knitting stitch, and how clumsy and awkward you felt, and how you cruise along now without maybe even looking at it. June has some wonderful advice, and she says to knit a swatch, whatever you're learning the new method, knit a swatch and then throw it away. So obviously choose some yarn that you're not attached to. Knit it, throw it away, move on. I've actually donated sweaters, my old sweaters, because of my sloppy finishing, or I actually didn't know how to purl correctly, so all of my initial sweaters had twisted stockinette instead of regular smooth stockinette. I could never figure out why my sweaters look so textured. But yeah, I've donated those, so they're out of my life. I've moved on. She says then to move on to something with a texture, like a fuzzy novelty yarn. Make a scarf and try to be forgiving, and don't expect yourself to be perfect right away, because it's just not going to happen. When I learned how to knit continental, I was switching from the throwing method, and I wanted to increase my speed because I was getting more into design and professional knitting, where I was always on a deadline, and I wanted to increase my productivity. So I had always heard that picking or continental or left-hand knitting or German knitting, all of those, all the same, that it was faster and more efficient. And I tried it, and it felt horrible at first. It felt really awkward. My hands were cramping, and I had like this claw kind of appendage. But I decided to cast on a sweater in the round, and I just forced myself to only use that method for the entire sweater. And it was stockinette. It was in the round. I actually recommend, for beginners, I've actually started to think that a cowl in the round is the best project to start with, because with scarves, you can actually, there's a lot of mistakes that can happen when you flip the work. You can forget to flip the work. I've seen that happen, which I'll discuss in a later video when we talk about backwards knitting. But knitting in the round just helps you practice the knit stitch over and over again. But don't put off purling for too long if you're teaching someone, because purling is something that a lot of knitters avoid and are afraid of, and without really good reason. So, but yeah, a scarf can tend to grow and be really wavy, and then the beginner will be self-conscious about how it looks, and rather, a tube, there's less room for error, I believe. Even if you drop some stitches, it kind of can look like a cool design element. So tensioning the yarn is the first thing that you have to do, and everyone has a different way of doing it. I personally keep it over my finger. Sometimes I wrap around my pinky once or twice, but I'm generally one of these kind of wrappers. But other people sometimes go around a middle finger, like I said, around the neck on a pin. You can actually buy little tensioning rings that you can feed the yarn into. Those are sort of an old-fashioned tool if you really have trouble figuring out a way. But the key is that practice is going to make perfect, and you have to achieve kind of a perfect balance between having it tensioned evenly and also being able to feed smoothly from the ball of yarn, from your yarn supply into the knitting. You don't want it to get too tight and tangled. You don't want to have to constantly be fiddling. That's going to slow you down. So play around with something that feels comfortable for you and that works for you. I find it really interesting that tension is actually what UK knitters call gauge, or they say you have to knit a tension swatch to figure out how to make your sweater, or to determine what needle size you're going to use. We don't use that term in the States. We use gauge for the most part, but tension actually accurately describes what you're talking about a little more, I think, because when you're making a stitch, you're actually determining the size of the stitch by wrapping the yarn around. Let me get a few stitches cast on here. You're wrapping the yarn around a needle and not the needle tip. That's an important thing to remember. If you see that a beginner that you're teaching, or if it's yourself, that the stitches are really tight, it probably means that you're working a little too close to the tips, and that is not forming a fully formed stitch. So you want to make sure that you're working down on the shaft and like around while you're forming to make the stitch. So that size of the stitch is what is determining your tension or your gauge, your stitches per inch number. And yeah, so that's just something to remember. Another thing about, let's just dive into right-hand knitting. So right-hand knitting is considered, June calls it the Cinderella of knitting methods, because it's kind of clumsy, awkward. It's sort of the forgotten method. It's what you teach children, and you want to quickly kind of progress further than that. But she really loves it, and in fact, a lot of people believed from her first edition of Principles of Knitting that was what she preferred, although she uses other methods now. She uses belt knitting. She's a continental person. She uses everything, but she does say that she will revert to this method, the right-hand method, if she's doing something complicated or working with a yarn where she needs to have total control. The reason that she says that you do have total control is because you are holding the yarn supply and making the tension for each stitch with these fingers here, which are the thumb and the forefinger. This is one of the first motor skills that babies kind of learn as little kids. They're sitting there and they're making these pinching motions. So she says that those are sensitive fingers and they give you a lot of control while you're wrapping. There's room for human error, of course. I think that when you can block out tension and consistencies, but you should aim for the most even tension you can possibly get when you're actually doing the knitting, because then there'll be less distance to travel to perfect it in the blocking process. So June also talks about ergonomics and knitting in a way that you're not going to injure yourself, and so that you can have the most efficient, speedy result. So basically she says to keep your shoulders down, everything relaxed, elbows in, and keep your hands low. So I'm bringing them up here just to show you what I'm doing, but keep them low in your lap. And we talk about needles a bit, or June talks about needles a bit, and it does feel like a conversation I'm in with her. It sounds a little crazy, but when you start reading it, you'll know what I mean. It's written in a very conversational tone. So you can't do certain types of knitting with certain types of needles. I'm just using double points here because they're short and it's what I have laying around. The belt method that we're going to talk about in a second, you can't do with short needles. You can't do with circular needles at all. The underarm method, which is related to that, you need to have long straights, and you can't do that with circulars at all. So knitting a needle is definitely something that can kind of determine style. There's certain styles that are, tied to certain styles of needle. The right finger method is something that I find myself defaulting to when I'm knitting on a DPN, or if I'm knitting lace or something cabled, something that is a little more complicated than stockinette or garter, because I don't know if it's because that is my method that I learned growing up, or if it's because I feel like I have more control. I have no idea. I haven't really thought about it too much. A lot of these things end up being automatic and you don't really think about them. And one of the great strengths of June's book is that she really gets into the mechanics of what she's doing and what's happening on the needles, and she describes it in excruciating detail. It's tempting to gloss over a lot of that stuff if you already know what you're doing, but I really encourage you, and so does she, to read through, visualize, try it with the yarn in your hands, and see if you can't fine-tune your own technique, because you might be surprised at what you can gain in terms of speed and even tension. So I'm actually doing right now the right finger method, which is related to the lever knitting and the cottage knitting and the belt knitting, which we'll talk about later, and they're all pretty much the same. I kind of consider it like throwing, but I tension the yarn the same way I would for continental left hand knitting, which we'll talk about at a later time. Everything's mirrored here, by the way. So the belt knitting right here is very exciting. This is also known as a mockin, and this was actually made by June's son, Jesse, and this is something that if you have the chance to buy, I absolutely recommend it. They're very hard to find in the States. They're not a very common knitting tool, but June is hoping to increase the popularity of them. And I had the chance to learn how to use it from June. I'll actually do that in a separate video some other time. It's really a whole thing that deserves its own video. But you may have also heard about the method from Stephanie Promlick-Fee, who has been traveling and teaching cottage style knitting, Irish lever knitting. Those terms kind of all describe the same thing, which is basically that the yarn is held stationary either in somebody's belt loop pocket, a little pin or something that kind of sticks in and you can anchor the needle, or this great knitting belt right here, or as my Nana taught me, under the armpit. I call that pit knitting. She uses 14-inch straights, and she has the needle under her arm, and basically what happens is when one needle is fixed, this is the one that's stuck into something and not moving, all the weight is not your responsibility anymore. It's supported by something else. So it's pretty nice because you can just it becomes a fulcrum, and then the other needle becomes a piston, and you can sort of work with great speed and efficiency, and you can also go mobile, and you can walk around and work the fields, or maybe do your grocery shopping, or watch your dog running in a park, or all kinds of things that you would not be able to do from the couch. You can do that when you're working with a knitting belt, at least. The pit knitting thing, like I said, it's related. It's not necessarily as practical, but it does feel very comfortable for a lot of people, depending on who taught you. A lot of these times, and that's why June points out that these terms are outdated, because the time, whoever taught you and whoever taught them, it kind of is passed down, and we all move around so much these days that the last method we'll talk about in the right hand is the parlor method, which is pretty interesting. It's considered a dainty style, and it's kind of hard. You basically have your wrists pointing down. I've seen people knit this way. I cannot really do it. It's so fancy. I don't look all that graceful, but the theory is that Victorian women didn't want to wear belts, and they also thought that it looked kind of coarse to, have a needle like this, so they decided to come up with a way to look very fancy while they knit. So it's funny. It's not particularly ergonomic because eventually you're supporting the whole weight of the knitting on this needle on your thumb, and your poor thumb. All of these methods are, rich with history, and it's sort of funny. You don't need to feel like you have to uphold whatever method you were taught with. If you learn one way from one person and something else later down the road, you teach yourself something from YouTube. This is what's so fascinating about knitting, is that it's ever changing, and you're not obligated to continue knitting the way you always have. Next time you're in a group of knitters, just take a poll, take a look around, and see how many different ways there are to hold the yarn and work the yarn and tension the yarn, and try not to be too dogmatic about your way being the right, the one true way. That's pretty silly. I always say that if it holds together and keeps you warm, then you're knitting, it's working. But yeah, there are definitely plenty of opportunities to refine what you know. Thanks for joining me for another episode. We'll kind of go back to yarn in the next one, and then we'll get back to this section and talk about left-handed knitting, and then get into some refinement techniques and some off-the-wall things that you may have never tried. Definitely check out the blog where all these show notes will be written up, and let me know if you're enjoying these or if you have any suggestions. This is a work in progress, and a giant one. So I hope you're enjoying it, and I'll see you soon.